Dear colleagues, my name is Michael Copland. I'm the coordinator with the Global Child Protection Area of Responsibility, and we support coordination groups at country level. We support those coordination groups to identify child protection needs and to organise the response at the interagency level to make sure that what we're doing is as effective and efficient as possible. I'm going to talk with you today about different groups of children who are of concern to us, and I'm going to go through a list of different groups, and at the end I'm also going to talk about why it's important that whilst we understand the specific needs and risks of those children, and in particular for this series their mental health and psychosocial support needs, it's also important that we work in a systematic way, recognizing that the same child indeed may have multiple risks, and we need to work as part of a system. We're going to talk about the following groups of children. We're going to talk about children with disabilities, unaccompanied and separated children, children associated with armed forces and groups, children in alternative care, children in contact with the criminal justice system, the justice system, street children, children leading child-headed households, and children at risk for child marriage. And before we go to those specific groups, a few general comments about working with these children. The first is that getting access to these children can be difficult and not straightforward. And that can vary. For example, children experiencing sexual violence, children with disabilities, for example, may be hidden away or the violence may be masked. So access requires a special effort and a special consideration, considering the barriers that children might have to access our services. And those barriers may vary depending on the age of the children, whether they're boys or girls, for example. So very important to think about access. It's really important to understand that each child is different. One size does not fit all. So whilst the background that we're going to give you is important, it's also important to keep in mind a child-centered approach, understanding the different needs of each individual child. Working with these children can be labor intensive, requires a lot of work, commitment, and resources, and I would encourage you to reach out for help to your peers and to others. Seek assistance as part of your work. Others may be able to learn from you, so do connect with others in your work. There are often strong community stigmas about these children, so whilst it's important we work directly with these children and with their families, where we can find and work with their families and caregivers, it's critical that we complement that work with community level work to improve the environment and to help ensure we've got an enabling environment for these children, free of stigma and prejudice. Intervening early with these children helps. It's more efficient, it helps to get better outcomes, and it helps children before things deteriorate and become worse. I'm going to take us through the groups of children. I'll reference some guidance, but as part of this module and video series, we'll be providing more detailed guidance. There's a lot of guidance available. Do take the time to review and become familiar with that guidance. The first group of children I want to talk about are children with disabilities. So we know that there's a high proportion of children with disabilities living in our communities, and there may be strong prejudice and very negative views about these children, which we need to overcome. Some of these views may affect us and our colleagues, and we need to look at our own assumptions. For example, we might assume that we can't work with children with disabilities to understand the situation or to design programs or to get feedback, that it's going to be too hard to organize for their participation. That's not true. We're able to work with children with disabilities, and we should. We need to not just focus on their physical challenges or situation, but also on their emotional and development situation as well. So we need a balanced and holistic view. There's good guidance available on how to take into consideration and adjust our needs assessments and response planning, and that guidance has been developed with the support of DFID, UNICEF, UNHCR. So do become familiar with that, and do make an effort to make sure that children with disability are part of our work and central to our work. They have particular risks, for example, of physical and sexual violence, and they may be hidden away. So again, an extra effort in terms of access and understanding. The next group of children I want to talk about are unaccompanied and separated children. Children may become separated from their caregivers in the middle of a crisis and become particularly at risk, for example, to recruitment, armed forces and groups, commercial sexual exploitation, and different forms of rights violations. We have many programs to identify, document, trace, and reunify those children with their families. That's a process with different steps that we need to go to. And while that process is ongoing, we need to make sure that children are in a safe place and that they're in frequent contact with us, that we monitor their situation. Some of the mental health and psychosocial support specific needs for these children, they may be coping with loss and an ambiguous situation, not knowing where their families, caregivers are. These children, frequently adolescents, but maybe younger children as well. It's important to recognize there may be quite different levels of vulnerability of unaccompanied and separated children depending on their age, whether they're boys or girls, and also the nature of their separation and the extent to which they're in contact with their families. The next group of children I want to talk about are children associated with armed forces and groups. So those are either children associated with national, state military, or groups that are operating in those territories. Unfortunately, we still have large numbers of children associated with armed forces and groups, and they may become part of those groups to serve different functions. They may be fighting, they may be providing other services to those groups, they may be exploited, for example, also for sexual purposes. So it's very important to understand that these children may face significant stigma when they're released and reintegrated back into the community. And that, of course, depends on the nature of the conflict and how that group is viewed by the community. But it's very important to work with the community as well as individual children and their family in a comprehensive way around all of their needs, their education needs, their health needs, their mental health and psychosocial support needs, and those assessments of their mental health need to happen at the beginning and continuously as they move to being back into the community. They may have experienced significant harm, witnessed traumatic events, but it's also important to recognize they may have acquired skills, may have particular strengths. So again, not to make assumptions about those children. Children may struggle to form part of the community. So very important as they re-enter communities that we support them in solving problems, in dealing with disputes, making friends, and becoming part of the community again. The next group of children I want to talk about are children in alternative care. So there's a range of different forms of alternative care. Children might be living in institutions with large numbers of other children. They might be living in foster care arrangements with registered foster carers. They might be living in informal care. So there's really a range of different care options, and it's very important to understand the quality of that care can vary significantly. The extent to which others are aware and able to support those care arrangements, or whether they're outside of a regular system and, as it were, hidden, which may create additional risks for those children. Children living in alternative care may be experiencing delays in terms of their development due to a lack of stimulation, lack of bonding with others. That's important to keep in mind, particularly as these children may also be moving from institution or setting to setting, which is also going to challenge their ability to make bonds and connect with others. They may, due to those changes which are outside of their control, feel that they do not have a sense of control, so a low locus of control for these children. The next group of children I want to talk about are children in contact with the justice system, and in particular children deprived of their liberty who are in detention. And this can be for a number of reasons, because they're involved with the criminal justice system, but also because they've been deprived of their liberty as they're suspected of being part of a particular group. It may be for migration, which unfortunately we've seen an increase of children being detained for these reasons. And having children in detention has an extremely negative impact on their mental health. They may experience depression, feelings of hopelessness, toxic stress, and anxiety, and they may not obviously be with caregivers. Unfortunately, they may be sometimes housed with adults. Access to these children is critical. I wanted to talk about children who are on the street. Sometimes we say children who are living, working on the street, and they face particular risks of abuse and exploitation, exposure and involvement in substance misuse, for example. They have particular concerns for mental health, for their mental health and psychosocial well-being. Those include anxieties, rejection and stigma, and loss and separation from loved ones. It's important when working with these children to represent that their survival and their economic and survival in terms of livelihood is derived often from being on the street. So when we work with them, we need to consider how they would survive otherwise. So any intervention needs to have an economic and a livelihood component. It's very important. To talk about child-headed households, so children who are managing and running a household and looking after other children that are particularly vulnerable. They may face significant stigma. And one of the key considerations when we work with these children is how to find time. They are managing a great load. So if we think about mental health and psychosocial support interventions, how do we support these children with their caregiving role, their livelihood role, to enable that to happen? We need to make sure we're not actually putting more stress and pressure on these children. They may need support, for example, with parenting. So getting others to help them out, to have time, to consider their own educational needs. For example, looking at their overall situation is really important. They may be feeling quite anxious. They may indeed be separated from loved ones and having a sense of loss. The next group of children I wanted to talk about are children at risk of child marriage, in particular girls who are most at risk of child marriage, and that involves considerable protection concerns, for example, sexual violence, sale of those girls, trafficking of those girls. They may be suffering particular mental health and psychosocial support needs, separation from their loved ones, depression, feeling of hopelessness, anxiety. It's important to recognize the role of education, both in terms of preventing the forced and early marriage of children, but also in terms of the response. There are considerable health needs, so really a comprehensive approach required in working with these children, particularly girls. So it's important to recognize that all of these children may be experiencing some form of physical and sexual violence. We now know that the levels of violence experienced by children, both physical and sexual, are incredibly high. So it's very important, whilst we've talked about these different groups of children, to understand that all children may experience emotional, physical and sexual violence, and to keep that in mind. There are good strategies to prevent violence, for example, evidence-based strategies called Inspire. I encourage you to become familiar with those strategies, and again with the guidance relevant to all of these different groups of children. There's a good deal of guidance, and that's available on different websites. The Child Protection Area of Responsibility website, there's a Save the Children Resource Centre, and the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action really is the place to go for technical guidance about these different groups of children, also with links to the Save the Children Resource Centre. Do have a look at the different pieces of guidance. I wanted to say something, as I promised, about working in a systematic way. So whilst each of these groups of children may have particular protection risks and risks for their mental health and psychosocial well-being, we need to understand firstly that one child may be experiencing many of these risks. I'll give you an example. A girl may become separated, so she's unaccompanied and separated, and then she may be forcibly recruited to an armed force or group. She's part of an armed force or group. She may be married to a military commander. She's under a child marriage, as it were. So you immediately see that one child can experience multiple vulnerabilities, and unfortunately these vulnerabilities often come together and interact with each other. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to think about the overall system in which we're working. So how is the system able to support different children with different needs, so that we've got a coordinated response, recognizing the links. Faced with having to deal with many children, we need to consider their vulnerability and unfortunately make decisions about who to prioritize. And in understanding vulnerability, it's important that we do that with children themselves by talking to them, talking with caregivers, talking with teachers, talking with community members to understand who may be most vulnerable, so we can prioritize. And obviously the age of the child, whether they're boys, whether they're girls, and their particular risks is very important. Finally, in all of this work, it's important that we work to minimum standards, and we have child protection minimum standards which were recently launched, and the different groups of children I mentioned are referenced there, and it's important that you become familiar with those standards. Identify which ones are most important for your work and what we need to do to meet those standards. Finally, again, do reach out to colleagues, to technical experts for support and advice, and also share your experiences. They're going to be valuable to your peers. I wish you well. Thank you for taking the time to be with me and to listen in, and thank you for your work in protecting children and supporting their mental health and psychosocial well-being. Thank you.